All right, ladies and gentlemen, so this is a live feed into the Shaun Harrison case. We're learning a little bit more about the defendant's relationship with the victim. So let's bring on my very special guest, former FBI agent and attorney, Bobby Chacon. Bobby, it's great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Jesse. Good to see you.
Bobby, so we're listening to this conversation through text message between the defendant and the victim. And literally their conversations before it's alleged that Harrison, the defendant, tried to kill the victim, Luis Rodriguez. What do you make of it?
Well, this is an attempt to corroborate the testimony that the witness victim gave last. And so, until you corroborate it, it's really just a quick statement. The defendant distanced themselves from it. And so, the witness said that they had certain conversations. And until you have something else that can corroborate that, it's really a he said situation. But now you have this basically objective, independent record of the conversations. And this is like the modern day version of a tap tape. You can actually hear the voices. You can actually see the words that they're typing. And, they're discussing weight and drug and mouth. They're discussing the amount.
Yeah. Well, not only that, you're listening to the relationship where the defendant, where the victim was. So let's step back for a second. The defendant was a dean at the English high school where Lewis was one of the students. Appeared that Harrison was one of his mentors, and you hear Rodriguez in the text message saying, "I have trust issues. Thanks for coming to me. I have trust issues in the past. I have a lot of stuff I want to talk to you about." And you heard in a text message from Harrison to the defendant, to the victim, say, "I'll never hurt you. You can trust me." All of this, and you can really hear that if this is all true, and that Harrison really betrayed the trust of Luis Rodriguez by shooting him in the head, it's pretty unbelievable to hear. Bobby, stand by. We're going to jump back into the live feed in the courtroom, and then we're going to take a quick break here on Law and Crime. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. As we wait for the audio to come back into the courtroom, there's a brief pause in the court. I want to bring back in Bobby Chacon. Bobby, so again, I know we kind of got cut off a little bit before, but in this case about a Boston pastor who's on trial for attempted murder charges, we saw earlier video footage, and I thought it was so interesting, trying to show who the shooter was through different surveillance footage and trying to determine whether or not that was actually Shaun Harrison. In your experience, surveillance footage, does that make or break a case?
Well, no, it's one piece of the whole puzzle that you have to put together. So in this case, the victim witness has described what happened and has identified himself and the defendant in that video. So now you see the video as another piece. So the victim witness's testimony is the first piece. The videotape kind of tries to corroborate all of that. So it's all these different pieces that go together. It's not, the video can almost never be, and in this case, it's so dark in some of the angles that it can never be, very determinative. But, with the more pieces you can put into the puzzle, the more clearer it becomes. So, it's a very good tool in this case to corroborate and to back up what the victim witness has already testified to.
Talking about a puzzle, I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to see this earlier, but so we know that there were articles of clothing found in Mr. Harrison's neighbor's storage bin, which Harrison had access to. We're talking about a pea coat and a blue hoodie. The question is, did that belong to Harrison? And the question is, was he wearing that the night of the shooting? They were showing surveillance footage of Harrison walking around in what appeared to be the same pea coat. So how effective is that for the jury trying to take these different points and saying, okay, well, maybe this is his pea coat, maybe this is not his pea coat, maybe he wore it, maybe he didn't. How effective is that?
Well, again, I mean, in this case, all hinges on the credibility of the victim witness. If the victim witness knew what he was wearing, what Harrison was wearing that night, if he describes that clothing, and then you can show that other witnesses saw him in similar or the same type clothing, and then you can further say he had access to a place where we found that clothing. I mean, that all starts to add up and mount up.
Exactly. It starts to add up, and the defendant has a lot of explaining to do. Bobby, stand by. We have a live feed back in the courtroom. That investigating officer is on the stand under cross-examination. Let's go live.
And what were the dates on those reports?
The date on the investigative report for the storage unit would have been, it should have been written on that same day, I believe.
Your first night, Judge?
Yes.
Okay, I believe there's a sidebar there in the courtroom. This is Law and Crime. This is Jesse Weber. We're covering the Shaun Harrison case. I want to bring back in Bobby Chacon. Bobby, we were just talking about how you said this case really is make or break depending upon the victim, because the victim in this case alleges that he was shot in the head by the defendant, was miraculously survived and able to testify. But let's talk about the victim. If Mr. Harrison was the shooter, why was the victim, Luis Rodriguez, so hesitant to first say that Harrison was the shooter? In fact, he said he wasn't even sure he was the shooter at first. And then it took him a few days, only after speaking to his aunt did he tell authorities that Harrison was the shooter. How are we supposed to believe that?
Well, I mean, I would explain it as fear. He feared this guy. This guy was obviously the boss. Harrison allegedly is the boss of a violent drug gang, right? You don't deal drugs without some amount of violence to protect that operation. So, and presumably he had others working for him. So even though Harrison might be under a microscope, you know, as a counselor to the school, he could have gotten other people to cause harm to the victim. So the victim, I'm sure, was, you know, he just survived a very close call, a shot that grazed his head that could have killed him. I'm sure there's a certain amount of fear in the immediate aftermath of that, because, you know, every friend of this victim's probably works for the Reverend. So he probably knows that there are other people out there that might be willing to do the Reverend's bidding to cause him further harm if he identifies the Reverend as the shooter. So I'm sure after you know, something like this, where you've been betrayed by your mentor or your counselor, you don't know who to trust and what to do. So you kind of go into a mode where you shut down everything and you don't speak. And so as you distance yourself from the event, you might be more comfortable in saying, you know, that's the guy that shot me. I know who shot me. So I would explain it, if I were the prosecution, as, you know, there's a little bit of fear, there's a little bit of shock. You know, there's other people that he has to consider before he, you know, takes action to identify, you know, the boss, because it's always hard to roll up on the boss. So I think there's a lot that has a lot to do with it. And I think if I was the prosecution, that's the kind of avenue I would explain to the jury, that this young man, I mean, he's what, 15, 16 years old. You know, this is a guy he's trusted in his life, has a great influence in his life. And now just start to shoot him in the head. I mean, that's got to put you in a certain state of bewilderment, shock, fear. And so it's going to take you an amount of time, maybe days, to come to a realization that I need to identify this guy and I need to go to the police.
Yeah, you make a great point that Rodriguez was being mentored by Harrison at this school. So what we learned was the text message conversations between Harrison and Luis Rodriguez. I'm going to read you. You talked about that betrayal of loyalty. Let's hear this. And maybe that was one of the reasons why he was maybe he was in disbelief. This could be one other avenue. Maybe he was in such disbelief that Harrison would shoot him. So Harrison wrote Luis Rodriguez, "I told you, G, you good. You show me loyalty, that goes a long way." Then Luis said, "I feel you, bro. It's hard to find loyalty. I trust you, G. I have bad trust issues because of the past." And what did Harrison say to Luis Rodriguez? "Little G, I will never hurt you, bro. I care about you." So you talked about it, Bobby, that betrayal of trust. Perhaps that's one reason why he didn't go first towards Harrison as the shooter. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, there's a lot more to analyze here on Law and Crime. That was some of the testimony of the victim in the Shaun Harrison case, the case that we're covering here on Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and I'm guiding you through this case right now because it's currently on break. We were in a live feed earlier, but it's on break right now. So Luis Rodriguez was a high school student at the English High School where the Reverend Shaun Harrison, a Boston preacher, was one of the deans at the high school. It's alleged that Harrison enlisted the help of Rodriguez to help sell drugs for him, marijuana, and that a dispute broke out between the two of them over decreased drug sales, and Harrison wanted Rodriguez taken out, shot him in the back of the head, execution style. That's the prosecution's story. That's the prosecution's theory. But is it a little too unbelievable for the jurors to swallow? Let's bring back in attorney and former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Bobby, is that the best defense in the sense that, okay, you have a guy who, from all accounts, never was involved in any shooting before. I'm talking about the defendant. was never on trial for murder before. And all of a sudden, at the age of, I think he's 55, maybe 56, he decides to take lethal action against a high school student by luring him out one night and shooting him in the back of the head. This is a guy who, when he got arrested, everybody was shocked to hear that he was involved in this. Is there an unbelievable aspect of this story that for the jurors might be too much for them to swallow?
Well, I mean, for the defense, it's their only hope. I mean, this is one of those cases where if you believe this one witness, if you believe this young victim, this victim witness, if you believe him, if you find him credible, the case is almost over. There's your reasonable, you have beyond reasonable doubt. He knew this gentleman. He interacted with him on a daily basis. He went for a walk with him. It's on video. I mean, if you find him credible, the case is over. So the defense has to, they're in the precarious position. You don't want to always attack a victim witness. But in this case, they have to, because if this victim is credible to the jury, it's over for them. So they have to attack him. They have to come up with a theory. Normally, you attack an eyewitness on two different things. If they don't know the attacker, you say it could be somebody that looks like the guy. You sure you saw him good. But in this case, you can't do that because he knows his attacker, or he claims to the attacker is someone he knows. So you have to find something else. So what you have in this case is you have a witness who's admitted drug dealer, right? This young man admits that he was dealing drugs. So you use that. That's the avenue you go down. A drug dealer is a bad person. A drug dealer is somebody who usually lies. A drug dealer is somebody who's not very credible. And in this case, he may have been attacked. The defense could come up and say he was attacked by his real drug dealing boss, who he is so afraid of that he cooked up Reverend Harrison as his patsy and said, that's the guy that shot me. And so he's creating this whole thing to cover up for the real boss of this drug gang that he's already admitted to being in. And he's so fearful of that guy that he used Reverend Harrison, who he knows is an innocent guy, would never harm anybody, is not going to retaliate, is probably going to be totally in shock of this accusation.
You're the second guest to say that there might be someone at the top of this whole criminal enterprise, that perhaps that's why Luis Rodriguez didn't first point the finger at Harrison.
Well, that's a tack I would take as a defense counsel. I don't know if I believe this gentleman or not, this witness not, but I'm saying that if you believe him, it's over. So you have to get him on something else. So you come up with an alternative theory. So that's one alternative theory that the defense can put forward to raise a reasonable doubt in a juror or two's mind. And so you have something there for the defense to build on. You do have the fact that this kid is an admitted drug dealer. He's a troubled youth. So that's something that the defense can exploit in this case. And I don't see much else that they can exploit in this case. So I would assume they're going to go down that road.
All right, well, we'll have to see. We are in a break in the live feed, so we're continuing to play for you right now the victim's testimony. Again, you don't always have that in any case where you get the victim to actually testify about what happened to him. So this is a continuation of his testimony, and when we get back, before we go to our next break, I'm going to ask Bobby the million-dollar question. Will Shaun Harrison, the defendant, take the stand? We'll get to that in a minute. This, again, is the victim, Luis Rodriguez. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so that is the victim, some of the victim's testimony in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts. Welcome back to Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm Jesse Weber, and that is the case that we're covering right now, the Reverend Shaun Harrison, a man who has been alleged to be leading a double life. On one hand, he was a Boston preacher, a dean at the English high school in Massachusetts, while on the other hand, he was really operating as a drug dealer. That's what the prosecution is saying. Not only a drug dealer, a drug kingpin that enlisted the help of high school students to help sell drugs for him. Mr. Rodriguez is alleged to have been one of those people that he enlisted the help of. And when sales were not so good, it's alleged that Harrison wanted to take out Rodriguez by shooting him in the back of the head, execution style. We've seen a lot of back and forth between the defense attorneys and the witnesses trying to poke holes in their theories. So what will the defense's ultimate strategy be when the prosecution rests? Let's bring back in Bobby Chacon. Bobby, I previewed it before I went to that clip. I'm going to ask you the million-dollar question. Will Shaun Harrison, the defendant, take the stand in this case?
In this case, I think he will. And, this is always, obviously, we've talked about this before, Jesse. It's always a very difficult decision for the defense to make. But I think they'll wait, and after the prosecution rests, and their case in chief is done and on the record, they'll reassess whether or not they should or need to, and they'll confer with their client, and they'll give the client their recommendation. Ultimately, it's the client's choice. But I think in this case, because I think the prosecution's case is so strong, I think they will put Reverend Harrison on the stand and get his story out, because you try to get the defendant's story out in other ways without putting them on the stand, through other evidence, and get other things in the record that kind of speak for the defendant, so you don't have to put him on the stand, him or her on the stand. In this case, I just don't think they're getting enough in the record to establish what they want their client's story to be at summation. So I think in this case, I think, in my opinion, I could be wrong, but I think you probably will see the Reverend take the stand.
Well, what is his story is really the question, right? Because you've seen multiple witnesses say that they saw him smoking weed, selling weed. They saw, I mean, when they raided his apartment, there were guns, drugs, ammunition. It's hard to deny all this. And then if you have, we got to talk about the jacket. So there's surveillance footage of him wearing this pea coat, what appears to be a pea coat. And what was found in his neighbor's storage locker was a pea coat. The question is, was that same pea coat the one worn by this shadowy figure in the surveillance footage of the shooting? So how does he go on the stand and say, I didn't do this, this is all a lie, I'm not a drug dealer? Doesn't he have to admit at least something? Because even from the text message conversations, which we just read between him and Luis Rodriguez, it's pretty clear it's about drug dealing. So yeah. What does he have to admit and what does he not admit?
That's a good question. I mean, because it opens up so many doors. And you're right. I mean, once he gets on the stand, now it gives the prosecution the right to question him on all of this stuff. So there's a lot there, you know, and that'll all go into the determination. I mean, look, if I was his lawyer, I would probably recommend he not testify. But I think that he's going to want to testify on this stuff. But you're right. There's a lot of damaging things that are in there. And you're right. He may have to come up with some kind of partial responsibility in some of this drug dealing, you know, stuff just to explain it away, because there's a lot that he needs to explain away, especially, like you said, on those search warrants where they found the guns. And I mean, you saw the defense attorney talk to the officer or cross-examine the officer on the coat, the issue of the coat. So on the video, you see somebody put a hood up as they're running away, and then he questions him about the pea coat and said, did that have a hood? Well, clearly it didn't have a hood, and he's implying that it's a different clothing, but clearly you can wear a hoodie under your jacket, under your pea coat, and which is probably what happened. So, you know, he asked the officer on course, like, well, the coat that you found, you saw in the video someone put the hood up, right, as they go away. Yes. Okay, the coat that you recovered, did it have a hood? And the officer says no. So those are the little kind of tricks.
Well, a blue hoodie was found in the storage locker. So you have the pea coat and the blue hoodie. You put two and two together, you have the person on the tape. I mean, I'm not trying to build the prosecution's case, but I'm allowing our viewers and our listeners to try to understand how they're working here. And that becomes the question. You make a great point. What will the defense do? Because they have to explain some of this. I think a lot of us are left with more questions than we have answers about how a guy, if this is all true, how did he even infiltrate the school system to be operating like that? And that's a separate question. And maybe we'll get to that a little bit later. But one of the places that we have to examine is the crime scene. So the shooting itself. Ryan Johnson from the Boston Police Department was a key witness talking about the crime scene. He testified earlier in this case. Let's play you some of his testimony right now. And again, for anybody just joining us, we are at a break in the live feed. But as soon as it comes back, we'll make sure to go to it. Again, this is Ryan Johnson. Wow. Whether this individual will live or die. That is an officer talking about the shooting victim in the Reverend Shaun Harrison case. Again, you have this defendant, this Boston pastor who's on trial. He's facing a lot of different crimes, including a lot of different charges, including gun charges, drug charges. But really, the main crux of this is, did he or did he not shoot Luis Rodriguez in 2015, this high school student where the defendant was one of the deans at the high school. And it's alleged that he was operating as a drug kingpin, hired Rodriguez to sell drugs for him. They got into a fight about drug sales, and then he shot him in the head. That's the prosecution's theory. And you hear this officer coming to the crime scene and wondering whether or not this young boy was going to live or die. Pretty incredible stuff. I want to bring back in Bobby Chacon. I'm going to ask you now the question that I've asked a lot of guests. If this is all true, if the Rev was actually a drug kingpin, was operating a system where he enlisted the help of high school students to not only sell drugs for him, but it's also should be noted that he enlisted the help to attack Luis Rodriguez as well. So there was at least one student who came forward and said, he asked me to attack Luis Rodriguez. Luis Rodriguez was also physically assaulted in school. He was tackled through a bathroom door by another student, and the question becomes, did Harrison direct that order? If all of this was going on at the English high school at Massachusetts, my question is how? How on earth could this be possible that a guy could slip through the cracks if the prosecution's case is accurate?
Well, Jesse, we often see where someone is in a position of trust and authority over young people, and they're victimizing those children, be it the sex crimes or drug trafficking like this. It often is multiple victims over a long period of time. And people always say the same thing, like, how could this go on so long? And how could so many people fall under his spell or fall victim to this person? It's because they occupy that position of authority, that position of trust. They don't get looked at as they get looked at as a beneficial figure in these people's lives. And quite frankly, in this case, Reverend Harrison may have been actually operating in that role. He may have been providing some good services to these children, maybe even their families. So, it's that position that they occupy that allows them to be looked over or looked past or not even looked at all for a number of years because of the good work ostensibly they're doing. And so, oftentimes we see when you have so many victims or such activity going on for a long period of time, it's because they occupy that position of trust it's not unquestioned, but it's questioned a lot less because of the position they're holding.
Of course, and we see it more and more. Not quite this example where you have a drug kingpin in the school, but like you said earlier, how many times do you open up the paper, you turn on the TV, and you see these situations about teachers abusing children in the classroom? I mean, it's horrible. It's horrible. But again, that's not really the main focus here. The focus is really for the jury. Will the jury ultimately convict Mr. Harrison of these crimes? That becomes the question. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks so much for joining us. So we are covering the Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts right now. We've been talking about it all during this program, about a Boston preacher who is on trial for a lot of different crimes, but really, he's on trial for allegedly trying to kill a high school student named Luis Rodriguez by shooting him in the back of the head, execution style, in 2015. Now, on the stand, we have a live feed back in the courtroom. On the stand is an officer who's been on for earlier today, talking about the evidence against Harrison, including reading text message conversations between the defendant and the victim, did a search of his apartment, found a shotgun and a rifle, looked at surveillance footage of the defendant. Now he's under cross-examination by the defense. Let's go live. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. This is a live feed into the Reverend Shaun Harrison case out of Massachusetts, a Boston pastor who's on trial for gun charges, drug charges, as well as charges in connection with the attempted murder of a high school student named Luis Rodriguez. On the stand right now is an officer who investigated Harrison, and he's being grilled under cross-examination about how thorough he was, or how thorough their department was in investigating Harrison, and perhaps they drew too many conclusions. And that becomes the question. I hope I have my guest with me right now, attorney and former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. Bobby, you still with me? What do you think about this cross-examination of this witness?
Well, I'm not sure where the defense is kind of trying to go with it. Earlier, we saw him question the first responding officer and describe the injuries that were, sustained by the victim upon arrival. That was clearly in an effort to say, the victim was conscious. Why didn't he identify a shooter?
Right.
But here, it's hard to know where he's going, with the photos. The photos are going to come in. They laid the foundation. They're in evidence. I don't really have a sense of what he's doing to try to break down this evidence.
Well, it seems to be, and it's a classic move of saying, did you just go after our client? Was that really what you did? Did you really investigate this as thoroughly as possible? I mean, I get that flavor a little bit. They're back live into the courtroom, so let's learn a little bit more.